Her words were, "I can't have children." The rancher grinned. "All right. I have enough children for both." 1886 in Wyoming. The dust and sage were covered in a golden sheen as the last of the summer's light floated across the expansive valley. Through the fences enclosing the Bennett Ranch, the wind whispered the dry aroma of hay and horses. Outside, the people whispered about this spot on the outskirts of town. The quiet man, the one with all the tiny ones, lives there. Standing by the wooden gate with her gloved hands firmly held in front of her was not Anth Coyle. She wore a travel-weary, simple cotton outfit that was the color of rain-soaked dirt. She had the expression of someone who had witnessed grief and was determined not to let it break her. She exuded serene grace and the elusive, unyielding spark of hope at the age of 28. Colt Bennett filled the frame as the door opened. He had tan skin from the sun and dust, tall and big shoulders from years of work. His eyes were calm, steady, and not icy. He studied her as if evaluating truth itself, and for a moment he said nothing. Anth's posture straightened. She said, "Mr. Bennett," quietly, "I was informed that you have kids here. I work as a teacher. If it's okay with you, I came to teach reading, writing, and maths." Colt leaned against the doorframe with one shoulder. He spoke in an even tone. "Have you ever had your own children?" The reality pressed like a stone below her ribs, and the inquiry made her gasp. "I cannot have children, but I will raise them with the love of a mother," she said softly after pausing. For a long time, the only sounds were the wind and the creak of wood outside. Colt's expression then changed. Something became softer. He smiled somewhat, but it was one of acceptance rather than sympathy. "Good," he finally said. "I've got enough kids for both." He moved out of the way and gestured for her to come along. With sunshine bouncing off the barn's tin roof, they made their way across the yard towards the corral. "Eli," he called. A 10-year-old youngster turned, sharp-eyed and robust. Finn, a younger youngster, about 5 or 6 years old, was next to him, almost tripped over his own boots while attempting to mimic his brother's stance. 2 girls were playing next to a pail. Nora, a kind-hearted youngster of 7, and 3-year-old Tiny Lahi holding a wooden doll that lacks eye buttons. The kids halted their games and gazed at Anth with the unbridled interest of those who haven't learnt to conceal it yet. Then, seemingly content, they resumed their games and laughter in the dust. Colt observed them for a while, his calmness subtly veiled by pride. "You can teach them in the parlor," he said. "The eldest is obstinate. The youngest occasionally goes for walks while she sleeps." Anth gave a small smile. With hesitation, she answered, "They're beautiful. You own them all." Colt watched the kids closely. He responded in a quiet voice, almost considerate enough to refer to them as "my." She accepted it as fact and nodded. He gazed upon them with a fondness that required no additional explanation. Colt led her to a tiny room next to the kitchen as the day was coming to an end. The bed was small but tidy, and the walls were made of simple wood. Beside a soft, kid-sized, half-finished crocheted shawl that was still awaiting the next row of stitches, a lamp flickered feebly on the table. Anth put her pack down and ran her fingers over the yarn. The warmth of tiny fingertips that had once touched it was almost palpable. She went outside to get some fresh air on the porch. Dusk has turned the world lavender. She noticed Colt holding young Leahy across the garden. He placed the infant in a cot close to the barn window with unexpected gentleness. He brushed her hair aside, drew the cover to her chin, and stood there for a little longer than he should have. Anth observed, his hair gleaming in the last of the light. Only the wind could sustain the whisper in which she spoke. No child would ever have to question their identity if their father was like that. Something subtle but certain surged in her chest as nightfall stretched its serene curtain over the landscape. She felt a slight sense of belonging for the first time in years, not because she could give life, but more because she might be able to give love and be accepted here. There was silence at Bennett Ranch on the first morning. A kettle was already hissing on the stove. A bottle of warmed milk wrapped in linen was left next to it, and Anapth woke up early with the sky still pale above the ridgeal lines. No note, no justification, just consideration demonstrated. The kids whispered to one another as they watched her at breakfast, apprehensive yet intrigued, and when she attempted to join them, they dispersed like quail. However, their big, anticipatory eyes followed her. She refrained from pushing. She observed their movements and the areas where they played. By midday, she had used a stick to smooth out a patch of dirt while creating shapes and letters. As she demonstrated to them how S slithered like a snake and curled like a cat's tail, she sung old songs. They began to sit close by the second afternoon. By the third, they were using their own fingers to trace letters. Every day, Colt went by the parlor without saying anything, but he did nod once when he noticed that they were sitting motionless. Even though he wasn't a cheerful man, there was a softer quality to his movements when they were close. The smallest, Lahi, was prone to nighttime wandering. On 2 occasions, Annabeth discovered her standing at the base of the stairs, her lips mumbling a melody that no one had taught her, her eyes half closed. Anth picked her up each time, carried her back, and placed her between the covers. She never fully woke up. One evening, Annabeth hummed an old lullaby from her early years while sitting next to her cot. Like a vow, Leahy's hand coiled around her finger. She couldn't sleep because of the moment. With a shirt buttoned incorrectly and one boot on backwards, Finn went into the kitchen on the 4th morning as sunshine streamed in. He smiled lopsidedly at her. After assisting him with button repair, she allowed him to show her the new word he had created using pebbles close to the well. Tree. She gave a clap. He smiled. Her presence changed the way the house breathed. She became adept at interpreting their rhythms. When Nora was anxious, she twisted her braid. How Eli hovered like a shadow at the periphery of every discussion, ready to say anything. How they appeared to Colt when they weren't sure. Additionally, he responded more by nodding than by speaking. She was cleaning tin plates by the pump one afternoon. The kids were skipping rocks down by the stream. She halted as she turned to face the porch. Colt was seated next to the door, holding a needle over a ripped sleeve with big, awkward fingers. Finn was the owner of the shirt. The green checked pattern was familiar to her. He mumbled, pricked his thumb, and tried again. She merely observed without saying anything. He glanced up briefly, met her gaze, and then looked down once again. "This one appeals to him," he whispered. She gave a nod. "It suits him." He continued to sew without grinning. After the kids had gone to bed later that evening, Anth went outdoors to get some fresh air. Over the hills, the moon hung softly and low. Behind her, she could hear Colt's boots. He remarked, "You're good with them." She turned to face the barn. "They make it easy." His arms were folded. "Not all the time." Anth turned to look at the house where 4 little children were sleeping soundly. "No, not always, but worth it," she muttered. He gave one nod. That was all. The shawl by her bed remained incomplete as the fire within crackled low. However, the house no longer felt alien. It had a lived-in quality, and gradually it also started to feel like hers. Late summer in Wyoming, the smell of horses and heat filled the air. Near the west fence, the kids played. Clattering boots, laughter, the sound of dry grass rustling. By the parlor window, Annabeth was organizing books when the silent Colt let forth a piercing cry. She hurried out. With her face white with agony, Nora lay at the base of the paddock fence, gripping her arm. Colt was already there, speaking in a strange and frenzied tone. "God, don't move," I said to her. "Don't move, Nora." Beside them, she fell to her knees. "Let me see." The girl had an incorrectly bent arm. She was not yet sure if it was bone or joint. However, Nora was shaking and biting her lip so forcefully that blood was coming out. Colt's hands were suspended in midair. The man who always seemed unflappable was clearly shaken for once. I didn't. All she was doing was climbing. I found 2 straight pieces of wood with her assistance. "Hurry!" He tore a fence slat in 2 as he scurried back. He moved wildly. Sharp breath. Anth gently positioned the homemade splint along the break after tearing her own apron into strips, whispering to Nora. "It's going to hurt, baby," she said. "But you're courageous." "I am aware of that." Despite her sobs, the girl nodded. Anth used her sleeve to clean Nora's forehead, tightened the splint evenly, and raised her head. Colt was kneeling across from her and had gone silent. His gaze remained fixed on Nora, but it was also filled with something more. Awe, guilt, and grief. In a hushed voice, he remarked, "I've never seen someone who's not a mother be a lot like one." She gave him a look but remained silent. Nora let out a whine. Anth gave her brow a kiss. "The worst is behind us. Sweetheart, let's get you inside." Cradled in his arms like a fragile and priceless object, Colt carried her. Anauth trailed behind, collecting the remnants of her poise and the scraps of fabric. Nora was placed in the spare bed. Anth used a moist towel to soothe her, prepared a pain reliever, and rubbed her hair till she fell asleep. Colt remained motionless and silent at the doorway the entire time. Long after the kids had stopped talking, Anapth sat by herself in her room later that evening. She unwrapped a tiny linen-wrapped box. Inside, a child's silk ribbon with the name Clara embroidered on it was tattered at the corners. She gently stroked it, but for the first time in years, no tears fell. Just a tiny, painful, genuine smile. The weeks went by in silence, with berry-stained fingers, chalk-traced letters, and the gruff sound of Colt's boots on the porch. As if she had always been there, the kids had embraced Anapth into their life. While Nora read aloud and Finn sung off-key next to her, she repaired torn hems, patched bruised knees, braided hair, and drew letters in the ground with a stick. Without asking, Colt handed her the kitchen, and he turned to her first when deciding whether to sell the Sorrow May mare or hold on to it for another month. Even though they weren't talking much, what they weren't saying now mattered just as much as what they did say. The regularity of everyday existence was then disrupted one morning by the sound of a second horse. A dark-coated man rode into the yard. Before taking off his hat, he grabbed a folded stack of papers from his saddlebag, and his boots struck the ground with deliberate force. His tone was professional and sharp. "I'm here on behalf of the Territory Welfare Office, Mr. Bennett." Colt took a step forward and gave one nod. "You live quite a distance from the courthouse, don't you?" The man said. "There's been a complaint. There are 4 minors living with you. None of them share your blood or name, according to county records." With her heart racing, Anth went onto the porch. "You're not recognized as a legal guardian," the man went on. "There are worries that this property does not fit the requirements for legal care. We must move the kids to the Cheyenne orphanage in 10 days. Colt tightened his jaw. He simply folded the notice slowly in his palms without saying anything. The silence was broken by Anth's voice. "These kids must be making a mistake." The man gave a headshake. "I don't set the rules, ma'am. All I do is carry them." Dust was trailing him like smoke as he galloped off. The garden was empty. The kids were already nestled in when Anapth discovered Colt sitting by himself on the porch that evening. He sat still, staring at the stars. The silence lingered as she fell onto the seat next to him. "I'm not their father," he said after that. "Not by blood. Eli, after a barn fire, I was discovered roaming. Nora was abandoned at the door of a church. His mother, Finn, passed away during the pandemic last spring. For stealing horses, La's father was executed. She had just turned 2 months old." His voice grew rougher than grit as he hesitated. "I am unable to create a family the way other people do, but I thought I could be a place to land after seeing 4 children who had nowhere to go." Anth extended her arm and placed her hand over his. "More than most men ever attempt, you become that." His eyes were unreadable as he faced her. "Will they not accept them?" "No," she answered plainly. "I have nothing to say about it, so no." Tension seeped into the children's bones inside the house. Whispering in the corners, they gazed at the adults with curious eyes. "Are we going to be sent away?" wondered Finn one evening as he raised his head from his partially completed sketch. While kneeling next to him, Anth combed his hair back. "No one's sending you anywhere, sweetheart. But according to that man, we don't belong here." She inhaled. "Steady. We occasionally have to remind those with the loudest papers that they don't know anything about families." She listened to the wind rattling the eaves while she lay awake in the nights that followed. The once secure house now seems to be perched above a threadbare rope bridge, wobbling due to uncontrollable forces. She started writing to neighbors, the pastor, and anybody who had previously sat in her clinic or told a story on the church steps, despite the fact that terror was still wrapping its fingers around her ribs. Slowly, however, word started to get out. Nothing had changed inside the house. Colt continued to leave the kettle on the burner before daybreak, and Lahi continued to sleepwalk. But now there was more between them all. Not simply love, but the type that is created when everything is in jeopardy. They still decide to remain. Anth was here to instruct. However, she now battled to save the exact item she never imagined finding again, a location where one can fit in. The storm came in like a living creature. The valley was teeming with low thunder. The house's eaves were being pulled violently by the wind. Anth had lit all the lanterns she could find, and the walls were covered in long shadows from their quivering flames. Lahi lay in the parlor, cuddled up against Anth's chest, her skin burning and her breathing coming in short gasps. She groaned in half-slumber, one hand gripping Annabeth's dress collar. Colt was silent as usual as he stood in the doorway. However, he regarded himself differently for whatever reason. His eyes were fixed on the small girl's face, bracing and rigid. Anth's temperature was increasing quickly as she looked up. He gave one nod. "I can ride," her voice broke. "The river is almost over, Colt. Just last week, a goods wagon was completely washed off that bridge." "I know," he replied. Despite his calm demeanor, there was iron behind it. "However, I'm aware of the location of the doctor's extra kit. If I don't return with assistance tonight." She responded, "You'll drown," getting up in the middle while keeping her arms around Lahi. "Even worse, once you arrive, the storm will prevent you from returning." Colt took a step forward. With one calloused hand on Anth's shoulder and the other on La's little back, he knelt by the fireplace. "I could never take care of all four as well as you can," he remarked softly. "But this is the part that is mine to do." Anth remained silent. She was unable to. She found his hand and gave it a firm squeeze. The window pane was howling in the wind. Then he got up, fastened the oilskin under his chin, and put on his coat. Without saying a word, he snatched the reins of the strongest gelding, tossed the saddle, and vanished into the rain, leaving only the faint flicker of lantern light to mark his departure. Time slowed to a horrible crawl inside. While murmuring lullabies into the bend of Lottie's neck and sponging her skin with ginger water, Anth placed her back down. The other kids hung close by, with Nora biting her thumbnail till it bled. Finn sitting still on the steps, and Eli pacing. "Is P coming back?" Finn once questioned, his voice scarcely heard above the rain. Anth felt her heart twist. She held him close as she gathered him into her free arm. She said in a whisper, "If it's for one of you." He would ride through anything. Hours passed in the span of minutes. Low in the belly of the sky, thunder roared. La's arms and legs jerked. She moved her lips and silently spoke Annabeth's name. Hoof beats follow. Quiet, then louder. 2 sets, not just one. Running to the door, Annabeth flung it open into the storm, dirt up to his knees, water gushing from his clothing, cold, wet, and pale. He had another horse in tow. With his knapsack in one hand and his saddle in the other, the doctor rode in the rear. Colt almost passed out in the doorway. He was grabbed by the arm by Anth. Breathless, he managed to say, "I got him." Received the kit as well. With a nod, she led the doctor inside. Leahy's fever had subsided by morning. Her lashes were thick as she lay enveloped in blankets, but her color was coming back. The home was silent, yet it was also filled with the hush of relief that comes after tragedy. With his coat half off and his boots still wet, Colt sat slouched in the corner chair, dozing off with one palm resting across his lap. For a considerable amount of time, Annabeth stood in the doorway and observed him. Shortly after daybreak, the door knocked. There were 2 county men standing there with clean boots and hats in hand. One had a sealed envelope in his hand. "We have confirmation," the man stated. "We've looked over your petition." Strong community testimony was received. He paused and looked at Annabeth before saying, "And the letter." It was sealed by Miss Coyle. He handed the letter to her. "While awaiting final approval, the removal order has been retracted. The kids can remain." Footsteps padded on the wooden floor behind her. Finn had heard. "Will we be staying?" he inquired. Anth lowered herself to his level and grinned while crying, "Yes, my love." "You've returned home." Colt woke up someplace behind them, and for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to accept that it was true. Even though the storm had passed, its echoes could still be heard in the porch floorboards creak, and in the way the wind felt kinder and gentler now. The letter came a week later. It was the type of letter that used to instill anxiety, sealed in an official envelope bearing the county stamp. Colt opened it steadily this time, but his hands started to shake as he read. "They approved it," he said, barely audible. "It's finished." Anth took a step forward. "Exactly what does it say?" She gave it to him. but before her eyes filled, she merely looked down once. She read quietly. Legal guardianship confirmed. Colt Bennett, guardian and only provider. Co-caretaker Anth Coyle is in charge of well-being and education. Already the kids were swarming about, sensing something significant. Anth knelt down and drew each one closer. Softly. "You're staying," she said. "No more farewells or inquiries. We are now a family." Not every phrase made sense to them. However, they could see that she was crying and that Colt was standing close by, leaning one hand on Eli's shoulder. They sobbed that night out of immense relief at being wanted, not terror. Something settled, not just tranquilly but belonging, in the kitchen, where a batch of cornbread had scorched slightly at the corners and the lamplight flickered softly against the ancient stone walls. Days went along, lighter and quieter. As if they were finally able to breathe, Colt and Anth walked through the home together. He began by asking her questions, initially modest ones. "Do you believe the cot should be moved to the other room? Is it better to teach Finn his letters or his numbers first?" She nodded, smiled, and occasionally touched his arm in response. She asked him to join her at the table one evening. This time, he stayed, even though he normally ate on the porch with his boots half off and his thoughts elsewhere. They consumed flatbread and stew. Nora snorted with laughter at a story she narrated. Startled by the sound, Colt looked up and then let out a low, sincere laugh. Later, she reached up to adjust his shirt collar as he got up to go. Warm from the sun and scratchy with stubble, her fingers touched the corner of his jaw. In that instant, they froze. Neither moved very fast, nor did they speak. She failed to come down one morning. Colt was standing in the kitchen, staring at the empty kettle and the chilly stove. He discovered her still in bed, flushed, not from a fever, but rather from sheer exhaustion. He tried then. He overcooked the eggs and burned the toast. The coffee was twice as bitter and as dark as darkness. But he carefully placed everything on the table. Additionally, there was a folded note with his square handwriting next to it. "Let me take care of everything you do for them today." She remained silent when she discovered it downstairs, simply closed her eyes for a longer than required moment, and put the note to her chest. That evening, Anabth rocked Lahi next to the fire while holding the child's curls in her little palm. Colt watched silently from a distance. He eventually responded, "I'm not much for big words," while keeping his gaze on the flames. "However, I was considering the possibility that this location could benefit us all if you stayed longer. For me as well." She didn't respond verbally. Her warm, soft hand found his as she passed him, and it remained there for a beat too long to be an accident. Neither of them spoke as he looked down and she looked up. Because not everything has to be said. Some forms of love develop not through words, but through shared stillness, quiet dinners, burned toast, and the wordless act of holding on to something. That year, winter arrived early and was relentless, harsh and piercing. Before the pumpkins were removed from the porch, the frost came, and a week later the ground was iron. The fields were buried. The barn was drifted against, and the woods were quieted by the thick, continuous sheets of snow that fell. One morning, Colt was standing at the doorway with his saddle pack slung over his shoulder and his scarf already tied tightly around his neck. Behind him, wrapped in his coat, Eli was gripping the horse's reins with an intensity that was too strong for a 10-year-old. "I will return in 2 days," Colt stated plainly. "Olson owes me, but town is also low. We'll figure something out." Anth remained silent. With her gaze fixed on his face, she gave him a wrapped gift of bread and jerky. "Take caution." His eyes grew softer. "Always." After that, their outlines were gradually absorbed by the white horizon as they rode away. The snow continued to fall. The wind had become fierce enough to peel bark by the end of the second day. Anth's knuckles were bleeding from cutting wood by the third. The creatures were agitated. Finn inquired twice about P's whereabouts. With shaky hands, Nora assisted in stirring the stew. Not in front of them, Anth showed no signs of dread. However, she sat by the fireplace and muttered prayers she hadn't said since her boy was taken from her, until the lamps went out, and the kids were nestled under layers of comforters. Then hoof-beats on the 4th morning, soon before dawn. She sprang to her feet and threw open the door. Colt staggered in, pulling an unresponsive Eli with him. Both were breathing, wet through and blue-lipped. With a hushed but urgent voice, Anth hurried over to them, Enter. Take off the coats. Now hot water. She stroked warmth back into their tense fingers, covered them in wool, and pressed broth between their lips. Eli managed a little hoarse as his eyes flitted and locked with hers. Apologies. She simply kissed his forehead without responding. She sneaked into the kitchen to get additional wood that evening once the fire was stable and the home was warm once more. Colt was already there, standing in the dim light, with steam still evaporating from his shoulders and a towel wrapped around his neck. Everything inside her exploded when his eyes locked with hers. She said, "You scared me," in a trembling voice. He took a slow step forward, as if he were walking up to a frightened colt. "I'm sorry," she said, gasping. I thought I lost you. I know." He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder as she turned away and put a fist to her mouth. His voice was scratchy as he remarked, "I've never had a place to come back to. Not at all. Not until you do." Anth pivoted. Although damp, her eyes were now steady. She said, "And I never thought I could be chosen. Not after all of this. After losing my boy, no. But when you give me that look," he took a step towards me. A guy who had given everything he owned to children who were not his was standing in front of the lady who made that sacrifice feel like a life worth living. Without a ring or flowers, he declared, "You can't have children. However, you've been a mother in all significant ways. I want you to stop instructing them," she gasped. "No, I want you to raise them with me as their mother and as my wife." Then there was silence, followed by soft but genuine weeping. After Annabeth gave a shaky nod, Colt drew her into his embrace. Only the quiet of the snow and the steady rhythm of two hearts finding a home could be heard outside. There were no crowds or fireworks. She cried for the first time, but it was out of love rather than grief. Like a silent apology, spring arrived. The earth softened following months of suffering and snowfall. Wild flowers nodded along the fence line, buds grew on branches, and the fields took on a fresh hue of promise. Once a place of whispers and rumors, the Bennett Ranch was now a hive of activity. White chairs were arranged in rows beneath the old oak tree behind the home, where the kids had spent summer hours laughing and sifting through dust. A loaf of bread. 2 lilac-filled tin cups and 2 copper wedding bands fashioned by the town's blacksmith were all on a table. With a cream-white dress and a simple hem that touched the grass, Anth stood at the edge of the clearing. A few stray strands of her hair, which was pinned back, caught the wind. Lahi clutched fast to Nora's hand in a crown of daisies as she tucked a wild flower into her sash. As they led her down the makeshift aisle, Eli and Finn stood at her sides, solemn-faced, and each holding one of her hands. Colt was at the front. He was dressed in a vest that was obviously pressed and used for the day. Even with his boots shining and his hair groomed, the light in his eyes was still visible. Neighbors, the preacher, and people from the town who had previously supported this peculiar little family made up the modest crowd. Others brought tears while others offered desserts. Colt took Annabeth's hands when it was time to exchange vows. His voice was low but certain as he replied, "I can't promise you riches, but I can assure you of this. You'll know you're loved, wanted, and needed here every morning when you get up." Anth was silent for a while. Her smile remained unwavering despite her lips quivering, and that was sufficient response. Colt welcomed every lost puppy and stray goat that came their way, fixed saddles for neighbors, and exchanged horses for seed. The kids, who were now sons and daughters instead of just kids, developed under the kind of love that stayed rather than shouted. Anth was sitting on the porch with a book one lovely afternoon. Lottie snuggled a doll to her chest and rested close by. On the wooden boards, Finn and Nora rolled marbles. Eli was assisting Colt in mending a broken bridle in the distance, their voices soft and hushed, their fingers dark with oil. As she observed them all, Annabeth said to herself, "I thought my life was over." As it happens, it was simply waiting to start over with him. Colt looked up, sensing her gaze but not hearing what she was saying. He whispered, "Anth, you're more than just their mother," while keeping his eyes fixed on the leather strap in his hands. "You are the mother of the entire household." She refrained from speaking and blinked back the unexpected burst of tears. Because sometimes it was no longer necessary to declare affection. All it needed was to survive. The hills were gently brushed by the breeze. The garden was filled with laughter. Someone made a mistake. A chicken gave a squawk. A kite took to the air. Blood was never the focus of family. It was about who came, who stayed, who rode out into storms if necessary, and who held your hand. And they lived and loved eternally on that porch, where spring was abundant and love was ingrained in the bones of a once broken woman and a quiet man who had more heart than most and too many children. We appreciate you sharing your writing with us during the emotional journey of her words were, "I can't have children." The rancher grinned. "Excellent. I've got enough kids for both." Don't forget to press the hype button if this story resonated with you and you think that love can create a family. Without blood, just the bravery to care and the determination to stick together. Share this video with someone who needs a gentle reminder that love, not walls, is what makes a home, and subscribe to the Wild West Love Stories channel. More gentle, strong cowboy romances are on the horizon. Real-life tales of perseverance, recovery, and second chances in open spaces. In the meantime, remember that often the most untamed frontiers are those found within one's own heart. Ride carefully and love profoundly.